Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining the launch of the Empowering Small Island Developing States Scaling Up Renewable Energy for Resilient Economic Growth report. We're pleased to host this important discussion virtually during Climate Week to allow participation from beyond New York. I'd like to first invite Chandrasekhar Govindrajulu, who is a practice manager at SMAP, to deliver opening remarks.
Thank you, Shamini. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to the launch of this report on empowering small island development states through renewable energy. It has been produced, drafted by the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program at the World Bank, as part of our Sustainable Renewable Risk Mitigation Initiative. I would first like to thank His Excellency Muawiyat Mohammed, Minister for State for Climate Change, Environment and Energy from the Republic of Maldives for making his time to join this event late in the evening. Thank you very much, sir, for joining the event. And all the panelists, please thank you so much for joining from IRENA, from the private sector, from other agencies. Thank you so much for joining. It's really an honor to have you all. You know, SIDS are among the most vulnerable to climate change, as we all know, but they only contribute a very small 1% to the global GHG emissions. But the climate risks are growing and increasing, and their impact on economic development and sustainable economic development in these countries is quite high because of the frequency of climate events as well as the rising sea level. Not only that, they also face high energy costs, as well energy security issues arising from the volatility of the prices. And to give you an example, we did an assessment that showed that SIDS roughly pay 31 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, which is roughly double the global average. So from that perspective, at the same time, they also have abundant of renewable energy, and they have put in place strong commitments as part of their NDCs for renewable energy development. And at the same time, they also get the co-benefits of renewable energy, such as clean environment, economic development, more private sector involvement, and reduced dependence on foreign imported fuels, and therefore foreign exchange savings. So it's a lot of positives as well on the opportunity side. Therefore, our program has been looking at specifically the SIDS as a way to promote the whole template of sustainable renewable risk mitigation. So that's going to be the focus of this discussion, on how do we bring innovative financing options, how do we encourage cutting-edge technologies that can help integrate renewables more. Maldives is always already trying on batteries, and how do we at the end of the day, how do we build local capacities really to make this happen? So those are the issues that we have discussed in this report, and I really look forward to the discussion and looking to hear a little bit more once we've heard a little bit more about the report, and then we'll go to the panelists. Thank you so much, Shamin.
Thank you very much, Chandra, for setting the scene for the conversation today. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome His Excellency Muawiyat Mohammed, Minister of State for Climate Change and Environment and Energy from the Republic of Maldives, to deliver some opening remarks. Minister, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good. First of all, thank you, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great privilege to welcome you all to this virtual launch of the SMAP 6 report on empowering small island developing states, scaling up renewable energy for resilient economic growth. I'm honored to be part of this important event, which highlights the unique challenges and opportunities faced by small island developing states in our quest for sustainable development. Today, we gather not only to celebrate the release of this vital report, but also to reaffirm our commitment to addressing the pressing issues that impact our islands. The findings and recommendations contained within this report serve as a critical resource for policymakers, stakeholders, and communities alike. They provide us with the insights needed to navigate the complexities of climate change, energy transition, and economic resilience. As we are all aware, small island developing states are on the front lines of climate change. Our economies, ecosystems, and the very way of our life are threatened by rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and the degradation of natural resources. However, we are also resilient and resourceful. The Small Island Developing States Report sheds light on innovative solutions and best practices that can empower us to harness renewable energy, enhance our adaptive capacities, and build more sustainable futures. Collaboration is the key. The challenges we face can be addressed if we work together, sharing knowledge, experiences, and resources. Today's event is an opportunity for all of us to engage in meaningful discussions. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the SMEP team and all those involved in the development of this report. Your dedication to supporting SIDS is invaluable, and we look forward to leveraging your insights as we continue our journey towards sustainable development. As we embark on today's discussions, let us remain focused on our shared goals and the urgent need to act. Together, we can turn challenges into opportunities and pave the way for a brighter future for our islands, and I look forward to a fruitful exchange of ideas today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those remarks and for your continued collaboration in working with us. With that, I'd like to invite Megan Meyer, who is the lead author, one of the lead authors of this report, to present some of the key findings from the report. Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Shamini. Thanks so much. Allow me to share my screen, please. Okay, I hope that's working well for everyone.
The screen is on perfectly.
Great. Thank you so much, Chandra and His Excellency Minister Mahayat Mohammed, for those very important introductory remarks and setting the scene correctly for the objectives of this session and the challenges facing SIDS. I'm very happy to be with you today and this distinguished panel and audience to discuss SRMI's latest report on scaling up renewable energy for resilient economic growth in SIDS. So I'll start first by describing a little bit more what is the context in SIDS. Small Island Developing States, or SIDS, are a heterogeneous group of 39 countries spread around the world. And despite their wide variation, they face many similar challenges in scaling up renewable energy, as well as bringing private sector finance into that agenda. In our report, we focused on 18 SIDS in particular, and those were filtered based on those SIDS that are World Bank client countries, also as well as data availability. And some of the common traits that we observe in SIDS were already mentioned by my colleagues, but having very small and isolated grids, The average installed capacity in power systems and SIDS, in the studied SIDS are 235 megawatts. But there's a very wide variation, as small as less than 5 megawatts in countries like Tuvalu, to close to 1,200 megawatts in countries like Jamaica and Mauritius. So obviously, countries of these varying sizes face very different challenges, even within the SIDS grouping, in terms of bringing private sector finance and scaling up renewable energies. SIDS also face a very heavy reliance on fossil fuels, with fossil fuels constituting it on average 85% of the power generation mix. And these fossil fuels are typically imported, expensive, and subject to high volatility, as Chandra alluded to, putting them at a high economic vulnerability to international price fluctuations. Many SIDS, over half, have offer explicit fossil fuel subsidies to help soften the impact of these high costs on their consumers. In some cases, reaching up to 3% of GDP, really putting a huge burden on the fiscal coffers of these small island states. As Chandra mentioned, they have very high tariffs at 31 cents on average, and we see a generally low integration of renewables and variable renewables. With the graph here shows in green the integration of renewables, and in brown is fossil fuel share in the power system mix. And in particular, variable renewables represent less than 3% across the board. And approximately half of the SIDS that we studied have no private sector investment, neither at the utility level nor in terms of IPPs. But on the other hand, as also was mentioned, there are abundant opportunities. SIDS typically have very high availability of renewable resources, wind, solar, and other types of renewables, and typically many times larger than their peak demand. They have a strong incentive, both in terms of increasing energy security and improving the fiscal situation to drive this energy transition. And given these high existing generation costs, in many cases, variable renewables, even when coupled with storage, can be the least cost option for power generation expansion in SIDS. SIDS have set out very ambitious targets, some of the most ambitious in the world. With over 90% of the selected SIDS have committed to achieving 100% of renewable energy integration by 2030, between 2030 and 2050 within their NDCs. And there also tends to be a very vibrant tourism industry falling under the CNI commercial industrial sector in SIDS. And the importance of ecotourism can provide additional incentives for these entities to integrate renewables, particularly distributed renewables, provided that the necessary regulatory incentives are in place. So in order to figure out how to maximize these opportunities, SRMI conducted a market sounding with key public and private stakeholders in the preparation of this report, in order to identify the key challenges and possible solutions in order to help scale up private investment for renewable energy in these countries. We looked at some of the common risks that face renewable energy development across the globe, development risks, operational and financing risks. In the case of development risk, we asked the market about the importance of grid risks, including connection risks, land risks, such as ownership and availability, resource availability, legal risks, including the regulatory frameworks, procurement risks, including risk for having failed tenders, and political risk. In terms of operational and financing risks, we queried about off-taker credit risk, including payment and termination risk, issues around the power sector risk in general, such as curtailment, currency and financing risk, macroeconomic risks, as well as, again, political risk in that phase of the process. As part of developing this market sounding and studying the results, we realized that there's two cross-cutting risks that are more prevalent in SIDS than in other markets that accentuate these typical risks that we see across the globe. One of those is scale, and the other is climate change. And so first I'll talk about these two cross-cutting risks, and then delve into the more traditional development, operational, and financing risks. You see that the issue of scale really is a critical, it's sort of a linchpin issue for many SIDS in terms of scaling up private investment in renewables, and it also leads to driving up costs. On this slide, and the figure shown here, we can see three important things. One is that, as we mentioned, the average system size is as I mentioned earlier, 235 megawatts, but nearly half of SIDS have systems below 60 megawatts. So really small, a clustering of very, very small systems. And while we mentioned as well that the average tariff is around 30 cents per kilowatt hour, it reaches as high as 52 cents in some countries. So these are really some of the highest tariffs observed around the world. This, we can see also a negative correlation between scale and tariffs. So those countries with smaller scale systems tend to also have the highest tariffs. This issue of scale creates a limited interest from investors and lenders who face fixed transaction costs for developing these projects that appear to be too high compared to the expected profits that they can gain. Another driver we found within the same issue of scale is CapEx. The small scale tends to be one of the drivers in increasing capital expenditure costs, which then increases tariffs. We found, based on the respondents surveyed, we found most respondents, majority of respondents, that there's at least a 10 to 20% markup on CapEx of developing projects in SIDS, with 15% of respondents indicating a 50% increase in CapEx costs to develop projects in SIDS. This has two very important impacts on the development of these projects. One is that it perpetuates a vicious cycle of higher tariffs, reducing affordability for consumers, which then decreases the ability of utilities to recover their costs, which then further increases the perception of risk to the market, and that further drives up tariffs because of risk premiums. This is critically important because 65% of the utilities in SIDS are not currently able to recover their costs. The other impact of these high costs is that it can deter decision makers within the countries from taking projects forward, because there's so much publicity about the very low costs for, in particular, solar around the world, and they may not see those kind of similar prices reflected in discussions with potential developers in their countries. The other cross-cutting challenge that we identified is climate change vulnerability, as has already been touched on this morning. So we have SIDS contributing only 1%, less than 1% of emissions, but bearing the largest impacts. As His Excellency mentioned, SIDS such as the Maldives, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, all face existential threats due to sea level rise. And beyond that, many SIDS faced a wide-ranging exposure to natural disasters that are expected to increase in their frequency and intensity, such as tropical cyclones and monsoons. And the power system infrastructure is very vulnerable to these events. It can result in catastrophic economic losses, as well as additional loss of life in the case that government services cannot be carried out during these events. And one heartbreaking example is the case of Hurricane Maria in 2017, Category 5 storm that devastated the power system, as well as many other aspects of life in Dominica, and caused a complete blackout of the power system, which lasted for months in some communities. This just highlights the importance of building in resiliency into the power system investments as we consider scaling up of renewables, not only for the power plants themselves, but also the grid infrastructure. However, there's a challenge, which is that these additional resiliency investments are costly, and this creates an additional burden on public sector and consumers who ultimately bear these costs. So transitioning to development risks, the results of our market sounding showed that development risks are perceived as the most critical risk in the market, with over 70% of the respondents saying that these risks are either critical or highly critical. And out of the risks that I mentioned earlier, 4 came out as being the most important based on our market sounding results. One is the lack of capacity in SIDS, and particularly for procurement. And this can lead to a number of different problems. One is that there can be failed procurements, which create a significant transaction cost for many parties involved and deter investors. And it can also lead to an increased prevalence of unsolicited proposals in SIDS, which can result in high tariffs. In fact, we saw that in SIDS that already have renewable energy IPPs, they don't have lower average tariffs, which indicated to us that many of these were likely the result of unsolicited procurements, not using competitive procurement mechanisms, which have been proven globally as part of the core ethos of SRMI to drive down costs. The integration of variable renewable energy can also be particularly challenging for grid stability. It is a challenge around the world in economies of all sizes, but particularly because of the small size of the grids in SIDS countries. They cannot absorb as well fluctuations in availability of power. So this becomes a key risk. However, we have seen examples already of small islands that have successfully done this, such as Réunion Island. It's not considered a SID, but it's a small French island in the Indian Ocean that has achieved 50 to 60% of renewable energy generation, variable renewable energy generation, as a result of investments in technology and grid modernization. Developers also flagged that many SIDs lack an up-to-date long-term sector plan. And this can fail to provide a clear vision to developers. As they think about moving into these small markets, they need additional clarity that the transaction costs involved will be recouped through a pipeline of potential investments in the future. And so if these plans are take many years to prepare, and by the time they're published, they're out of date or they're not well communicated to the market, that can create a sense that there's not enough long-term opportunity for investors to come in. Finally, for development risks, stakeholder risks came out as a key consideration, which is particularly important in the context of small island states. They have small and close-knit populations in many cases. So disapproval from a small number of people can actually have an outsized impact on the ability of projects to move forward. In terms of financing and operational risks, we again see capacity as a cross-cutting issue. Another issue that we see is constraints to access to international financing. As I mentioned before, many financiers they have minimum ticket sizes that fall well above, that are well above the typical project size in these countries, meaning that they're just simply not willing to come in. That highlights the importance of utilizing local banks, but many of these local banks don't have the technical or balance sheet capacity to implement these projects. Public sector has limited fiscal space, so it's not possible in many cases for them to be taking these projects onto their own balance sheet. So this becomes a difficult situation to overcome, and figuring out how to unlock viable financing for these projects. In terms of operational risks, we see off-taker liquidity and bankability, particularly relevant in the SIDs located in the Asia and Africa regions, which have a higher percentage of utilities that aren't recovering their cost. Participants frequently mention the lack of qualified workforce, meaning that labor needs to be imported, which can be costly and even impractical in many cases. And a similar issue applies to attracting EPCs, as does to attract international financing. International EPCs may not be willing to come into these small markets because of the transaction costs involved. And they may also find that even if they do come in, hire subcontracting national companies, those companies don't have the balance sheets that allow them to get the guarantees required for eventually the project to be able to secure financing. So it becomes quite a challenging problem to try to figure out how to develop either better guarantee mechanisms for EPCs, international EPCs, or more local and regional capacity of EPCs that can develop these projects. In general, you can see that many of these risks, including the cross-cutting risks, are intertwined and build on each other. But the good news is we have already identified a number of solutions. We're really interested in discussing these with the panelists today. One example would be for overcoming scale and climate change vulnerability, development of hybrid projects with solar, for example, solar and battery power together, which can help increase ticket size and increase interest from international financiers. Financial intermediary options can also allow for larger international banks to channel funding to local and regional banks once their capacity is developed, so that we can increase financial flows from these larger pots of funding into these smaller markets. Standardized documentation was flagged as a very important mitigation measure to help reduce transaction costs, recognizing that there's it's not possible to do a cookie cutter approach across these islands, right? Every project in every country will require different documentation, but there is an ability to create templates that can help improve the managing expectations on both sides of the transaction of what kind of clauses will be required in order to take these projects forward. It's important to focus on least change in mentality from least cost planning to least regret power system planning, given the high vulnerability of these power systems to the impacts of climate change. And that will require increased costs for building and resiliency and leveraging additional sources of climate finance and concessional financing. Resilience, of course, needs to be built into specifications and trying to identify other forms of renewable baseload technologies such as geothermal, hydropower that can come in to support the high levels of integration of renewables that SIDS have set out as their targets. Increasing local capacity, both in skills and financing, will be critical. Improving planning of power system planning and grid infrastructure updates. Importantly, maximizing socioeconomic benefits can help to reduce the stakeholder risks. And SRMI has produced an entire report dedicated to how to maximize these socioeconomic benefits across all countries and as they think about scaling up renewables. The last thing I'll touch on is the risk mitigation mechanisms. So this will be critically important, as well as tariff buy-down mechanisms to help kickstart the private investment in these countries. The World Bank has been quite involved in this. We have a number of different guarantee instruments, and in particular, we have piloted this tariff buy-down mechanism in the Maldives, and it's proven to be very successful, and we're looking now to see how we can scale that up in other contexts. SRMI is launching a financial innovation window, which will seek to crowd in capital from the donor community and elsewhere in order to help SIDS overcome these critical challenges where some small amount of additional grant funding or risk mitigation mechanisms can really unlock significant renewable energy scale up. So in closing, I'll just state again that there's abundant opportunities and readily available mechanisms to allow the scale up of renewable energy. And it's really critical that we take an approach that focuses not only on the benefits for climate change, but really those priority issues for countries: energy security, increased economic competitiveness and development, the growth of green jobs, and building in power system resilience. Because of the disproportionate impacts that SIDS countries face for the challenge of climate change, it's really imperative that the international community, including donors, MDBs, climate funds, et cetera, come together to help support SIDS in financing these additional costs that they will bear and ensuring that their power systems can be resilient and green going into the middle of the century. So with that, I'll stop. I'll close. Thank you very much. And back over to you, Shamini. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Megan, for the thorough and detailed presentation and for highlighting not only the challenges, but some of the solutions that SRMI is working on along with the World Bank Group and through SMAP. Now I'm going to open up the panel discussion, and we are very lucky to have some incredible panelists joining us today from all corners of the world. So I'll invite Arietta Gonalevu-Rakai, who is the SIDS Lighthouse Initiative Lead at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. Dr. Amit Jain, who is a Senior Energy Specialist at the World Bank. Paul Makumbe, who is the Pacific Regional Director at Chemical Energy. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. I know that it is 2 a.m. for you in the Pacific, and we appreciate you joining this panel. And James Ellsmore, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Island Innovation. So thank you all for joining us today. Let me kick off with my first question to you, Arietta. The SIDS Lighthouse Initiative has successfully mobilized partnerships, and we heard partnership mentioned both by Chandra and by His Excellency Mohammed as a critical thing that we need to support renewable energy projects across SIDS. Can you share some of the most impactful success stories from the SIDS Lighthouse Initiative and what key factors have contributed to their success?
Thank you, Shamini. First, let me start by thanking the World Bank for the opportunity to provide some insights, and also congratulate you on the launch of the report. Timely, indeed, as the backdrop of the adoption of the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for Seeds, they've charted the way for the next 10 years, not only towards a resilient, prosperous future, but also ensuring it's energy secure and inclusive, equitable for all. Let me start with the Seeds Lighthouses initiative. I feel that it is a success story in the sense that it was launched in response to the call for action 10 years ago. And it provided a collaborative platform for seeds to highlight their priorities. And to date, we've brought together 41 seeds, including territories. So it also provides opportunities for island territories to work with partners to pursue their energy transition and energy transition efforts. And as highlighted in all international and regional fora, capacity, financial, and tailored technology transfer are the three top priorities amongst others. And we've made sure that this is highlighted in all the forums, such as this event, in other international fora for COP and others, and at our assembly as well. At the political level, we've worked very closely with the Alliance of Small Island States. We have a joint energy compact, and we have a target, the Seeds Lighthouses target of 10 gigawatt of installed capacity by 2030. And to date, it sits at 8.7 gigawatt. But to reach the last mile, to close the gap, ensuring that no one is left behind, we need everyone at the table. That includes the private sector, the financing institutions, the youths, the women, and the civil societies. I'm actually joining you from the margins of the Pacific Senior Energy Officials meeting in Fiji. So I'm in the same time zone as Paul. The coffees has helped a lot in staying awake, but partnerships has also been highlighted. Governments cannot do it alone. And civil societies and youths, they've highlighted that they've been left behind in all these consultations. The academia were also part of the discussions. So it was very important for all stakeholders, relevant stakeholders, to come together. So for me, these are success stories. We also work together with regional utilities, such as the Pacific Power Association and Carilac in the Caribbean, to develop bankable IPPs and ensure that the private sector is involved. But the key remains that they need investment, and attractive investment, blended financing that is attractive and tailored to seeds needs. Some success stories at the country level. I'll start with Sao Tome and Principe. We've recently assessed all their health centers, but we couldn't do it alone. We had to work with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP country office, who was key in linking us to all the key stakeholders on the ground, and the coordination with the Ministry of Energy, and even strengthening internal coordination in government, Ministry of Health, the hospitals, and all the key stakeholders in the health sectors. And we've managed to, provide recommendations that form the proposal that UNDP and the government was able to submit to Shell Foundation and partners. And we've heard that they're in talks to secure this financing for implementation. Another example is Vanuatu. We have technical assistants who's sitting with the Ministry of Energy, writing proposals. It might be different from powering 1 million houses in Uzbekistan to 300s in the Pacific, but it matters. Every life matters. Every 11.6 million population in Pacific matters. They need to be electrified. They need to have that energy access. And these proposals have been picked up by ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and UNDP. And these are the success stories of a partnership. We might do capacity building. We might, design bankable IPPs, design bankable project proposals, but we need all the partners at the table. We need the financing institutions to tailor the financing packages to seeds needs, and also for private sector. In terms of enabling frameworks, I'll give Fiji as an example. We are currently reviewing their legislations to increase private sector participation in the electricity sector. Let's start there. So that is a partnership between government, the utility, all the stakeholders in the Fiji energy sector. I don't know how many minutes I have.
No,
but
I think that you've covered quite a lot.
So I'll
You
stop
covered
there, and
a
then
wide
I'll see.
variety.
Let's circle
And
back if there's any follow-up. Thanks. Back to you,
no,
Shalini.
I think, I was noting down some of the things that you were saying. You talked about, first the community of practice that SIDS Lighthouse is, and sort of what it's helped achieve in creating that. And the Energy Compact, 8.7 gigawatts out of the 10 gigawatt goal is quite a large achievement. Thank you for touching on, finance. When Megan was presenting, there was a question in the Q&A section that came before she concluded. And in her presentation, she somewhat addressed some of those, the aspect of the question, but it was related to finance, right? And you mentioned philanthropy. So I think that those are all key. So thank you for sharing such a broad insight from the SIDS Lighthouse Initiative's work. Amit, let me go over to you. We had the Minister of Energy and Climate, Minister of Climate and Energy from Maldives join us to deliver opening remarks. And you've been working on the Maldives Energy Project, and it's been quite a successful example of de-risking investments to attract private sector investment in renewable energy. Could you share a bit more about the specific strategies that was used and the approach that was used in Maldives, and how this could be adapted to other SIDS? As Arietta mentioned, we need them in every SIDS country in terms of climate justice, not just mitigation.
Thank you, Shamini, first for having me on this panel discussion. I'll just build upon what Honorable Minister mentioned in his opening remarks. See, before we start de-risking solutions for small islands like Maldives, it's very important to understand what are the basic characteristics of a power system in very small countries, especially island nations. So when we started working in Maldives 10 years back, we realized these are very small systems which are vulnerable to even small injections of solar and wind. We are all big fans of renewables, but we must understand the grid stability in these islands is very low. So before we start injecting renewables at a faster pace, our learning in Maldives has been the step one should be the grid enhancement, so it can absorb more renewables. Step number two should be to install storage systems, including energy management system and battery management system. Only as step three, we should come up with large injections of solar and wind. 10-15% is all right, but when we start moving towards more than 10-15% of renewables, this is especially true for small economies like Maldives and other countries. For big economies, they can still absorb large quantities of renewable. So that was the first learning, which I would like to share with my other colleagues, that this is the approach we followed in Maldives. Second, we should accept the fact that these are small countries where transaction cost and time is very high. Just imagine an investor who had the option of investing in India, Pakistan, Nepal. He has his hands full. His opportunity cost for going to Maldives is very small. And this is true for both medium and large scale investors. So we were to some extent competing with our large neighbors, which were attracting gigawatts, and in Maldives, we were selling only megawatts. So what we did a couple of things. One, we started aggregating projects. Every project in Maldives is between 1 to 3 megawatts. we combined many of these projects and we started bringing bid of 10 to 15 megawatts. So demand aggregation is first. Second, we had several roadshows with the investors and we try to understand what are the risk parameters when they are coming to Maldives or any other SIDS countries. Off-taker risk is the number one risk, they told us. Then, as Megan mentioned in her presentation, land right of way are other risk. And third and final, in case of macro fiscal scenarios, because these islands are very much dependent on tourism, we saw during COVID times, we also saw during Ukraine and Russia war, when the oil spikes, these countries come to the verge of even bankruptcy. So investors are very conscious of coming and investing in countries which are very susceptible to macro risk. So we devised a 3-tier risk mitigation framework in Maldives. What it did very quickly, first, we set up a funded escrow account in the Bank of Maldives stationed. And I repeat the word, it was funded escrow account. 6 months of PPA payments were put in the Bank of Maldives as a dollar account, which investors could see that the money is lying there in case of any delayed payments, we will be funded by this bank. Step number 2, currency convertibility. Taking dollars out from the countries, small island countries, is always a challenging. We made sure that in the contracts, in the PPAs which were signed by investors, it was clearly mentioned that the government will make sure that the dollars earned as a result of PPA invoice should be given to investors to take them out. Third and the fourth most, World Bank came up the guarantees both from MEGA and the IDA guarantee and say, if everything goes wrong, we will provide the termination risk guarantee in the Maldives. But even after providing these 3 risk parameters, it took us 5 to 7 years to convince the investors. We started from 1.5 megawatt, and this year we are bidding out 25 megawatts. We started with 4 investors. Last bidding, we had 63 investors. The price has come down from 21 cents to 9 cents. So this is the journey which we have done in the last 10 years in Maldives. Thank you.
Thanks, Amit. That's quite an incredible achievement, right? You not only laid out the steps, but going from when you said 5 to 7 years, I saw Paul's eyes sort of wonder, wow, look at this long time frame. But that work led to, the cost going from 21 cents to 9 cents and the investors going from, in like single digits to almost 63, you said. So that's quite a lot, quite an achievement. Paul, I'll come to you next. I think that Amit touched on it a bit, and Arietta also mentioned this, and as did Megan in her presentation. Cameco is not just in the Pacifics, you operate in other places in the world as well. How are you approaching renewable energy investments in the SIDS differently than in other regions? And what are some unique challenges you've encountered as a developer?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I think I'm kind of feel like I'm Johnny on the spot when it comes to the finance questions. Everything seems to lead to finance, and that's true, right? One of the things that Cameco has been doing over the last 3 years is that we've been working on designing a blended facility called Tides, which is effectively really aimed at solving a lot of the problems that Megan and Arietta and Amit, everyone touched on. Really, if you think about renewable energy or energy access in the SIDS, one of the things that we see, as we pointed out, is that the ticket sizes are small, deal sizes small, capacity and capability is almost really, really small. And then the other part of it is the access to financing is incredibly difficult. So what we've tried to do is to take a look at all of those things and design a blended facility that effectively deals with trying to solve all of those challenges so that we can accelerate investment and participation by private sector, and then actually enabling the people in SIDS to actually have access to energy at not just having access, but having access to energy in an equitable, we haven't yet quite got to 9 cents per kilowatt hour, but I think that is the target, right? So the blended facility that we've designed is effectively working with donors, so to provide a first loss, and that allows us to then work with private sector investors to then come into that structure where you've got 20% provided as a first loss by donors, and then you have debt and equity being provided by private enterprises, right? So that's there to kind of like de-risk for the private sector investors. And the other part of it, what we've done is that we've made sure that we're not just dealing with providing project capital. We've put alongside that, worked with the donors to create what we call a market development facility, which is really about ensuring that it's one thing to have the financing available, but we need to make sure that we're building capacity and capability, right? So, and that market development facility is structured into three. One is development loans, which we're saying, like, we work with developers in these countries, and we want to make sure that they have the working capital and the capability to bring these projects to financial close, right? Second part of it is a technical assistance fund, where we say, so what are the gaps from a capacity point of view that we need to solve to enable these developers and these projects to actually come to fruition? And when we talk about those gaps, it's everything from technical to looking at the regulatory environment, working with the regulators. So we're pretty flexible in how we apply that technical facility. And then the third part is really a viability gap. So, we talk about a lot of the conversation, has been really about the networks, the utility networks but there is literally in the Pacific, probably about 60% of the population don't have access to electricity, and the grid is not going to get there. It doesn't make sense to build out that grid. So we need to start thinking about building mini grids and ensuring that, the price for power on those mini grids is equitable to what it would be on, where it is possible on the networks. And the way to do that is to have this viability gap where we're saying to developers, yes, go and develop projects that are mini grids. It's going to be harder than building a grid connected system, but there's this viability gap that ensures that the off-takers or the beneficiaries are paying an equitable price, and you as a developer make an equitable return, right? And then the other part that we've worked on is we've talked about this. These deals are really small, and if you try and put them through a project financing structure and you use long form documents, it's not going to work. So we've worked on ways how we become more developer centric, identifying developers, build capacity in developers, and then enabling them to aggregate projects into a vehicle that then allows us to be able to to finance a lot of these smaller transactions and do it at scale and at pace, right?
Thank you for sharing some of the innovative work Camco is doing. Specifically, I hope that this aggregation of projects, if that's been done successfully yet, and if you've managed to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing some of that in trialing it in Africa with a vehicle we call Spark, and now that sort of innovation we bringing to the Pacific and localizing the requirements of what the Pacific requires. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, James, let me come to you. The Virtual Island Summit, which is something Island Innovation hosts yearly, brings together diverse stakeholders from islands worldwide to share knowledge and best practices. What are some of the most innovative solutions or initiatives you've seen emerging from these summits that could be replicated across SIDS to advance renewable energy transition? Paul just mentioned mini grids in his remarks, so I'd love to hear about what are some things you've been hearing in the meetings you've been hosting.
Thanks so much, Samini, and thanks for hosting this great discussion. I think, I mean, our approach is to engage with islands of any jurisdictional status. So Arietta mentioned specifically that the Lighthouse program, SIDS Lighthouse program also engages with territories, which I think is very important because there are many island jurisdictions that often fall through the cracks and are not able to engage with many international programs or funding programs. And so our approach engages with island statuses that may be local municipalities of countries in the European Union, for example. It could be SIDS countries themselves or territories, etc. And this is really important because actually the physical characteristics of island grids or island systems actually share a lot in common, regardless of their location. And so there's much to be learned from that exchange of knowledge between SIDS countries, for example, or island jurisdictions in other parts of the world. And also really important that that information can be exchanged in all directions. So there's some great advancements taking place in SIDS countries that really kind of show a pathway for other island regions to learn from. And part of that is because the island regions are really forced to innovate and be at the forefront of change and find solutions for some of these elements that may not already have been mapped out already, simply because whether it's the cost pressures or the climate pressures that exist, they're really exacerbated in those island territories. And so therefore, those island territories find themselves at the forefront of really trying to figure out how to solve these problems that many other regions will also have down the line as well. But of course, no one jurisdiction has solved every problem, and that's one of the challenges. There are many places that may have done really well in one sector and lag behind in other areas. And the other big challenge is often you see some territories make really good territories or countries make really strong advancements, and then the government changes or other factors change and things come to a halt and take a step backwards, which is quite sad to say. I won't say specific countries there, but I'm sure people familiar with SIDS countries will know examples of countries that have really taken a change in direction with a change in government. And it's a shame that something like renewable energy would have that political elements. But we know that the technology is not the primary barrier. The technology is already there when it comes to the renewable energy transition. But the big barriers for many of the island regions are either social barriers, policy barriers, or primarily, and I would say the biggest one, the economic barriers that exist. And that might be a direct economic barrier, access to investment and finance, but also secondary elements such as the ability to insure projects or the ability or the high rate of interest on loans that are available, for example. And again, obviously that varies a lot between different regions. I did want to share, so you specifically mentioned the virtual island summit, which just happened. We had one session, and one of the previous speakers specifically mentioned this challenge with island grids and the stability of island grids, and I think that's critical. It was very interesting to hear that experience from the Maldives, that we can want all the renewable energy we can desire, but if our grid is not stable, then we have that limit. So I'll actually just post this link in the chat in case any of the attendees are interested. But this session that we hosted on decarbonizing island grids, and that was very interesting because we had speakers from the Caribbean, from Mauritius, obviously larger island jurisdictions that are dealing with these challenges. Mauritius is over 1 million people, and so dealing with island grid on a much larger scale, but then also a speaker from the Aran Islands in the Republic of Ireland, which has just a few hundred people. And so they're dealing on this very micro scale of the island grid and how they can manage that change there. So again, even within the island context, your grid has this huge variation from one to another. But I think it's important to say that across these different regions, there is still these important commonalities, as we've heard from the previous speakers.
So I very ambitiously thought we'd be able to have multiple questions, but when you all shared your remarks, you had so many insightful things to share. I didn't want to interrupt you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you all a question and ask you to respond. And ultimately, in your view, we've talked quite a lot about the challenges, right? What are some really critical factors that will determine the success of renewable energy projects in SIDS? And, and what can be done in terms of stakeholder collaboration to address this? Paul, I'll actually, sorry, Paul, I'll go to you first.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I think the key thing that's going to make this successful is forums and platforms like this, the ability to share experiences, so that we're not recreating the wheel or making mistakes that have been made before, I think is critical. And then there is a part of this that each one of us needs to take away, which is, we need to set our ambitions a lot higher than what we currently have today, right? I think we should all not rest until we have equitable energy access that is scalable to meet development and growing needs. It's the only way we don't leave any human potential behind as the world goes forward. So, collaboration and more ambition.
Thank you. Those are, key things. James, over to you.
Thank you. I think I'll underline the access to finance element. Access to finance can look different in different places. Obviously, climate finance has become a key topic in the UNFCCC climate change process. But I think finance also has to be beyond just grants and aid funding, to be finance available through the private sector, which is still a huge challenge. So tackling some of those barriers that exist to being able to finance projects and attract that private sector investment.
Arietta?
Thanks, Shamini. My perspective is that we should not treat energy or electricity in isolation. It should be addressed holistically. It's not just for sustainable development. It's also about climate resilience. It's about water, food, health security. So approaching this holistically will get us there. And SEEDS are speaking with one voice, and they've made it clear what their priorities are. I think we as partners provide the platform and also need to bring everyone to the table to respond to what SEEDS are saying and ensure that the solutions we put forward are tailored to SEEDS, not just getting our agenda and interests across. Thanks.
Thank you. That's just a slight, small problem you just snuck in there at the end of your remarks. Amit, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. If there's one word I would say for bringing energy transition in SIDS, I would say it's bankability. And bankability may vary from country to country and island to island. For example, in a relatively more advanced island like Mauritius, where energy access and finance is not a challenge, but bankability of PPA is a challenge. So how do we structure the PPA in such a manner that the private investors feel comfortable that the PPA will not be renegotiated few years down the line? So I think depending upon the islands, we have to identify what can increase the bankability in SIDS.
Thank you all for joining the panel. For my last question, you all had varied answers, but all of them I think are critical, from setting higher ambitious target for equitable, scalable, renewable energy solutions to a holistic approach and addressing finance and, of course, bankability of projects. These are all key things you've mentioned, and we need to tackle all of them to, as Paul put it, to not leave behind any human potential. So thank you for joining this